You are listening to the Necropolis podcast, which is brought to you by Jason from Goatcraft and Shelly from HateMeditations.com and Metal Legion magazine. Welcome to Necropolis. This is episode 100. We have made it all the way to 100 episodes. I do want to thank Mr. Shelly and Tyler for filling in for some of those episodes where I was MIA. Life and all of that has been really crazy. I haven't been able to be as involved with the podcast as much as I would have liked. As well as nowadays, I am working full-time and doing grad school. And with that, I do have a time management issue, so I doubt I will be appearing much at all on the podcast moving forward. But when time allows, I will be joining, of course, because this is the baby I started during quarantine just to stay in touch and chat about metal and put our thoughts out there to the public. So yeah, I do want the podcast to continue, and I am handing it over to Tyler and Shelly while I'm busy at grad school. I also forgot to mention my name is, if you haven't ever listened to this podcast before, I am Jason, also known as Lone Goat from Goatcraft, also part of that Garden Gnome Dungeon Synth stuff that kind of rabble-roused a little bit for a couple of years, and didn't really go viral, but it did go semi-viral just because of the shenanigans. And also, I do have that penis black metal project, Amorphophallus Titanum, and my pronouns are just so that's out there, so you know how I want to be gendered. And we do have Tyler, of course, joining today. Tyler, his pronouns are morbid and visions. Thank you, Tyler, for joining.
Thank you for correctly gendering me, Jason. Very happy to be here. Very excited to be doing the 100th episode special.
Yes, we will be having libations of an abundance, so if we're all over the place, we do apologize. And we do have Mr. Shelley. His pronouns are Das Kapital. Mr. Shelley, thank you for holding down the fort.
Woohoo! 100! I'm glad to be here. Thank you very much.
Oh, excellent people. I was listening to that Terminus podcast, and they threw some shade at you, Shelley. And one of the guys was like, I would never work with a Marxist. I'm like, dude, you need to have the Marxists in your fucking area, so at least you understand where the fuck they're coming from, and so you're just not blindly criticizing things you don't really know about. Like, I love Shelly. He's a great person. We mesh with metal and all around good chap. But when it comes to the politics, we do kind of diverge quite a bit. So if you want to cast shade at me for working with Shelly, you're more than welcome to. But I just think it's rather stupid. I try to have a broad circle of friends from all walks of life, and I think that makes me more well-rounded. But anyway, today we are discussing gatekeeping. This is a topic that always comes up, especially in modern discourse about metal, like traditionalism versus like the post-black and shoegazing shit. Like there's always this huge divide. Nowadays we have RA being black metal and all this crazy shit going on in extreme metal. And I do want to kind of do a thought experiment here for a second, since I am going to grad school for philosophy. I know it's crazy, but let's do the trolley problem. So the trolley problem is, and I'm sure many of you out there have heard what it is. There's two railroad tracks, and you have a lever, and the train is going to kill one or the other who are tied down to the railroad tracks. So if you could choose, I'll start with Shelly here. If there's one elitist that you can save, or there's 5 posers, which would you save? Like, would you kill the 5 posers to save the one elitist?
How do I orchestrate the situation so I can kill everyone? That would be my question.
That's easy. Haven't you seen the memes?
Experiment.
It's called double track drifting.
When you try to pull in extra variables, it's either this or that. There's no extra variables in there.
Tyler just referenced the memes. Apparently it's called double track drifting.
No, it's actually called the trolley problem.
No, that's when you turn the train at such an angle that you have one set of wheels on one track and one set of wheels on the other, and then you run over everyone.
Oh yeah. Well, that's not doable in the thought experiment.
I'm saying that not to be facetious. I'm obviously as a a guy with 2 philosophy degrees. I'm very familiar with the trolley problem. In this instance, though, the reason I am saying this is because I would try to kill everyone because I don't respect posers. Although I guess we'd need to kind of clarify what we actually mean by that. But I guess in the very kind of late 90s, early 2000s vernacular, it's people that use metal or other alternative culture like iconography for sort of status rather than actually kind of engaging with it as an art form. Whereas elitism, I guess, I've obviously often been accused of elitism or even a wannabe elitist or whatever, but I don't necessarily agree with that either because part of the reason why I write and think and like post about metal a lot is because I do want other music fans to engage with it and kind of love it. Like I quite like listening and reading like other people's opinions on music that I don't necessarily know much about. Like ambience is a good example of that. And I kind of want to get into it. In the same way, I want to pull people in good faith into getting into things like black metal and death metal and so on. But again, I guess we'd need to understand what we mean by elitist because it's often conflated with having discernment or standards which just to me is not the same thing, whereas elitist obviously has a very negative connotation. Or am I overthinking it? Should I just be going along with the fact that this is a stupid meme?
No, you're not overthinking it. I think that these are all going to be awesome points for discussion.
No, Shelley, you are overthinking it.
All right, let's get Tyler's take.
Well, the thing, okay, let me put in one more aspect. You know everybody. So, one elitist that you deem an elitist, okay? This is from your perspective. One's an elitist, and 5 are fucking posers. You know them all personally. Which would you save?
Okay, so the point of the trolley problem is to establish a difference between allowing someone to die and pulling the lever, which is an intentional action, which is basically intentionally killing someone, aka murder. But there is a sense in which you did not tie these people to the track. You were placed in this situation against your will. So an alternative reading of the trolley problem is imagine there is a bridge over the rail track and you are in a position to push a very, very large person in front of the trolley, which will stop the trolley, and thus save everybody. But in doing so, you will be even more intentionally killing someone. I think in that instance, I would probably opt for that. In that, I would rather kill a very, very doughy stranger than I would.
Fat shaming.
Confirmed. Shelley is fat phobic.
Oh shit! I was ready to edit the fuck out of this to make sure Jason doesn't get cancelled, but I was the first one to fat shame. I am sorry.
All right, I have the answer.
What's your answer? You have the answer, Tyler, not just your answer, but the answer.
I have the
Here's
answer.
the ultimate truth coming your way via Mr. Tyler.
I am going to direct the trolley towards the elitist, jump off of the trolley, lay next to the elitist, and say, hey man, don't worry, pretty soon we won't have to deal with those annoying posers.
Ritual suicide.
Well, this did not go as planned. It's either this or that. Neither of you did that. Like, you're supposed to either.
I mean, in effect, I did. I killed an
elitist.
elitist. I killed 2 elitists. Does that
Kill
more points?
yourself or someone you love. That's what you did. Okay,
Right.
Jason. What's the quote unquote correct answer?
There is no correct answer. You choose one or the other, but you both lose because you failed at that. You threw in extra variables, and that's not part of the problem. Imagine if you're doing a algebra equation and you throw in all these extra numbers. Now it's gone to shit, and that's what happened to the trolley problem.
All right, yeah. Jason is applying thought experiments correctly here in that you are supposed to say there are no variables, and then you establish what your moral intuitions are, and therefore you learn something about morality. If you're gonna treat the thought experiments in the way they're academically intended to, that's fine. I respect that, Jason. I thought we were trying to be entertaining.
Well,
the Heinz dilemma proved that, like, if you don't answer, the thought experiment, according to the rules of the thought experiment, you fail. Like the Heinz dilemma, you guys both know what that is. I mean, it's kind of boring shit, but Heinz dilemma is where, say your wife is about to die and there's some medication that can save her, but you don't have the money to buy the medication. Do you steal it or not? And a lot of people who took that thought experiment, they refused to give a straight up answer, so they all failed. You're supposed to say, yes, I would steal the medication, or no, I would let my wife die.
Oh, that's
So
100% easy. I would steal the money in a heartbeat. No problem.
you see, I wouldn't, because number one, I don't have a wife, and number two, I know you're both married, so you both choose your wife over,
Yeah, but you
breaking.
just subverted the parameters of the experiment. You're supposed to imagine that you have a wife in this thought experiment, Jason. A wife
Well,
that you love.
Yeah, Jason, there are no other variables.
well, Schopenhauer said that
Oh, here we
philosophers
go.
do not marry. Philosophers do not marry, according to Schopenhauer. So if I were to marry, she would not be a genuine wife. So I wouldn't break the law. Like
Oh,
I'm in
you
league with
broke the law. You
Kantian.
failed the
I'm
Heinz
in league with Kantian ethics, where duty. You have to uphold duty and
Okay,
laws.
so 10 minutes in and he's mentioned Schopenhauer. I used to do that with classical music, but now that you're a philosophy nerd, we're doing it with Schopenhauer. But you are right. Kant would say, uh, well, he actually didn't he give the very example of if an axe murderer shows up and you have to lie and say the person that he's trying to murder is not in the house, you have to do your duty and actually tell the truth because his like commitment to fulfilling one's duty was that profound that he kind of said, you when two duties conflict, you kind of have to do the one that is the most primary or whatever. I'm probably bastardizing that. It's been 10 years since
So
I
it's
graduated, but
implied that Kant thinks that you should tell him the person he's trying to murder is in the house and then beat his ass.
oh no, it was some other condition that he did add there, but yeah, it's been many years since I read Kant, but
It's like, yeah, you're
So
victims here, but you're not going to get to him, if you know what I mean.
all I've
yeah.
learned about Kant, well, I know when it comes to pronouncing his name, we all pronounce it wrong, because it's not Kant, it's not Kant. It sounds more like cunt. That's like the region of Germany that he's from. That's how they used to pronounce his name was Kant. Um, just FYI, we all say it wrong, and if we say it correctly, we say a bad word. Didn't know if you
Yet
knew
another
that or
trolley
not.
problem.
Yep, it's one of those dilemmas, man. One of those thought experiment dilemmas. Do you want to be publicly shamed for being correct, or do you want to
Uh,
be incorrect and get along with how society operates and
yeah, it was
polite
Prussia,
society?
Prussia where he was born, where yeah, apparently just people were a little bit cunty. Um, so what about gatekeepers then?
So I think that's a value judgment, right, Shelley, Mr. Philosophy? If someone is to keep the gate, there's a judgment that they've made in terms of value for them to be there, keeping the gate closed and all that. So would you agree that value judgments come into play with gatekeeping?
Well, absolutely, it's obviously a value judgment. But you're right to call attention to that because it is a descriptive term, i.e., it's used to describe a person, but there is an implicit kind of underlayer of not just value judgments, but kind of cultural um, anxieties underneath it as well. I think I realize this conversation could get quite messy, but I would like to do a sort of make a distinction between metal, gatekeepers in metal, which is obviously what we're going to discuss. I'd wanted to make a distinction between metal that happens in physical spaces, i.e., gigs, festivals, record stores, meetups, whatever, like wherever else metal happens in the physical space, and then metal more in the abstract, not necessarily on the internet, but just in terms of the music that you want to listen to, the way you want to celebrate that music or discuss it with friends and so on in a more sort of conceptual way. I guess, this podcast is part of that as well in terms of just the albums that we like or we don't like and the disagreements that we have over that. And I think people often conflate the fact that, gigs, uh, they should be open to anyone that obviously wants to attend, but there is a certain kind of culture and atmosphere to a metal gig that is distinct from a reggae gig, distinct from a rave gig, distinct from a old school blues gig or bluegrass or whatever. Like every kind of cultural setting has its own set of like norms and also likely kind of demographics and so on. And people often sort of conflate people trying to bar people from metal venues that aren't that don't look like they would fit, i.e., they show up. I don't know, it's a woman in a white dress who is not wearing a black band t-shirt or whatever, or it's a um, person that just it would seem incongruous at that venue with people actually just not necessarily criticizing, but talking about metal in the abstract in quite a challenging or combative way sometimes. Um, and I kind of want to draw a distinction between those two things straight away. And I think, given the sort of preoccupations of this podcast, we're probably going to be more talking about the abstract form of gatekeeping, which does play out online a lot, but also, it is particularly relevant to music criticism, music discussion about particular albums, particular bands, particular ideas within metal, rather than the physical, to quote the progressives, lived experience of being out in metal environments and so on.
Right. Yeah, this is a rather complex issue. And I do agree that we tend to deal with things in the abstract more than like a phenomenological reduction, like an immediate experience of reality, where a good case in point would be when Cam Lee saw me naked. I know we chatted about that. So 100% he did see me fucking naked, Shelly.
Yeah, no, he
I
he
never
admitted
lied
it.
about that.
Yeah.
But the same day, like it was Cam Lee who saw me naked, and then I also had a chat with the guys from Insanity, an old band from the '80s and early '90s, because they were playing the same festival, and they were talking about the early days of death metal, and with that, they said the decline literally began when all the Metallica jocks got into death metal. So they weren't really invested in the death metal expression, which was scary and very satanic, especially at that point in time where the satanic panic was going on. All of a sudden, there was an influx of like jock-minded people who just like listen to Megadeth and Metallica and all that. And I would say that is a phenomenological reduction, like of his experience. It's not so much in the abstract, like we tend to deal with. It's more of just like his lived, firsthand experience of what caused, the decline of death metal, which was the Metallica jocks, which could be equated to posers. So I
Well,
do think.
before I pass off the title, I think I literally touched on this in the Slayer episode, where we make a distinction between the Slayer of the Show No Mercy, Hell Awaits era, who were very much, they were wearing eyeliner, they were being very satanic, they were influenced heavily by very unapologetically like heavy metal music, like Merciful Fate, Judas Priest, that kind of thing, and they were kind of developing that. And then you have the Slayer of the mid 90s, where they do kind of slot into that jock metal kind of thing, where it's, big buff dudes slapping around each other in the mosh pit, wearing football shirts or whatever, and, that post Pantera kind of vibe, where it's this artifact of American machismo or whatever. And it's very different to the Slayer that you see on those first two albums, especially. And that's a really good illustration of like how thrash in particular or speed metal was appropriated by that thing that you're talking about, the jocks who wear cargo shorts and work out, and they sort of see metal as just purely like energy music or music for movement, as opposed to how we would listen to it, where you sit back and you absorb the kind of the narrative and the interaction of riffs and themes and so on.
Yes, Tyler, do you have any thoughts on that in terms of Slayer, or uh, what are your thoughts on like lived experience, such as the guy from Insanity? What he expressed was the beginning of the decline of death metal was allowing in the posers. That itself brought about the decline.
Well, it touches on the question, what is gatekeeping? I interact with a pretty decent number of heavy metal devoted groups on social media, and you kind of see two concepts of what gatekeeping is in most of those groups. You have one, which is, I think, the one that we are speaking of, which is that you have someone who actually wants to exclude people entirely um, from the scene, whether it's physically in the sense of don't come to the shows, don't come to the festivals, or more so in the abstract of don't listen to this music. Um, and then you have another concept of gatekeeping that may be actually a kind of straw man. That it's not someone who's necessarily trying to exclude people, it's someone who's trying to dictate what people should listen to. And I feel like it's important to distinguish between the two because people often conflate the two and use the latter, the dictating what people listen to, as a means of criticizing the former. Like how ridiculous is it that this person wants to control what other people do? I mean, as someone who, I'll be frank, sympathizes with gatekeeping, I've never understood that criticism because I always have said to those people, I don't want to dictate what anybody listens to. I'd much rather those people go listen to pop music rather than dilute the genre that I appreciate by making it more like pop music. I'm not going to tell them they can't. But anyhow, I think that the jock influx into death metal and also the jock influx into the Slayer fandom was definitely a degradation. And I think it's pretty much exactly for the reason that Shelley said. Those people see the music as an accessory or as a how do I want to put this? Ephemeral experience. It's something that you enjoy in the same way, perhaps that you would enjoy eating a candy bar that you like, or
Okay, we need to go deeper into the ephemerality of aesthetic expression because I think we have different interpretations of what that is.
yeah. I mean, I'm using the word very vaguely. I'm not trying to be technical about it. Because contrary to some of the comments I see that seem to think that I think that good music is defined by complex music theory and philosophical principles, nah, bro, I have no academic training in those subjects, and that's why I've never said that. And anytime those subjects are brought up, I've always loudly said, I don't know anything about that stuff. I just think it sounds good. um,
I've never
but
understood that. Given that one of your favorite albums is Morbid Visions, which is one of the sloppiest, most untechnical death metal albums going. Like,
I think it's just a almost kind of like the straw man for gatekeeping. Like, oh, how ridiculous is it that these people want to dictate what other people listen to? It's just a fun straw man to throw at somebody who likes something you don't. Like, oh, you freaking nerd! You're talking about all this music theory stuff. Normal, well-adjusted people don't know about that stuff. Surprise! I don't either. Uh,
but
so,
there's a difference with that. Like, yeah, it's like, yeah, we think about the music that we listen to, and it's not like we're well, we are quite pretentious about it sometimes. I'll fully own that, and yeah, I quite like being pretentious about it sometimes. But yeah, I give a lot of thought to the art that I like, and not everybody does, and that's absolutely fine. And some people might find the ideas that I espouse about it quite ridiculous, and that's also fine. But come at me on my own terms and discuss them with me in good faith. Don't try and undermine what I'm saying by saying like I don't have any knowledge or I don't like
or you must
or I'm
be
trying
like
to do it as like a
a touch
stand-in for my
starved nerd or something.
personality. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's like that's fine. Like it's okay if you disagree. It's okay actually if I'm making you quite angry, but engage with the ideas and don't try and sort of undermine my motivation for talking about it, I guess.
Oh, that's 100% what they're doing because we all know that the dirty secret is that anyone who's commenting on Necropolis is someone who has thought about music on a deeper level because you're not going to find us on Metal Sucks or in Decibel Magazine. You're
True.
somebody who's plugged
Motherfucker, I've
in.
been at Decibel Magazine like a few times. I mean, I've been in the
You
printed
have,
version.
sure, but I mean, I'm
I
not,
mean,
I
we've
don't,
had a guy from Decibel on this podcast a couple times.
yeah, I
Yeah,
just don't
but
think we have that wide of visibility that we're we're known in mainstream audiences. I'm saying
yeah, we have like 400 subscribers, dude. Like it's not
most
many.
people who find this podcast, even if they're being critical of it, are people who are exactly the kind of people they're being critical of in those like sarcastic quips of "Oh, you touch starved nerd talking about music theory." They just want to look cool on the internet. Um, but anyhow, back to
So
gatekeeping.
I would actually so just to develop on your point around so we talked about the sort of the jocks entering the Metallica and Slayer fandom as like an example of this, and to bring it more recently, something I've been thinking about a lot lately is And it is something we discussed on the podcast before. Is obviously like we're in the 2020s now. Is that where we are in time? And metal
Right.
has
The aura of the music, the aura of metal has certainly waned. It's not. It used to be culturally relevant at one point in time, and now it's just like disposable entertainment. So I have unfortunately been exposed to the philosopher, cultural critic Walter Benjamin, and his concept of the aura, which was later taken by another philosopher, Swedish guy, probably butcher his name, so I'm not going to say it. But the Swedish guy, he said, all art is like essentially tethered to the time and place it came from, and the further you are removed from that, the more it loses its authenticity. So in that regard, like metal has already blew its load. It's no longer culturally relevant. You have fucking video games having, really extreme guitar textures, but it's in this more like vibe type of mode. So I do believe that there is a element that metal is dead because it's not what it used to be, where it was culturally relevant. It was like this huge subculture that just had so much going on. In turn, I know I'm talking about the social aspect of it, but there's also arguments to be made that the best quality metal, in terms of sheer volume, came out during that period where it was like a revolt against uh, mainstream Christianity, because we had like the Reagan administration and all that, and all the pious Republicans, and it was rejecting all of that, and it scared the shit out of those people, like those Republicans back then, and it's
well,
no
the
longer like
Satanic Panic was like
countercultural.
quite unique
Yeah,
in that the commercial success of metal coincided with the artistic success of metal in the late 80s and early 90s.
that's where it hit its boom. So you had this overabundance of expression being put out there. Like you count all the classic albums, and you even look at like the B tier shit that came out back then. That's better than the shit being released today. I'm sorry, Tyler, but Samath is, they would be a B tier band if they came out in the late '80s, early '90s. But because the vast majority of shit being released nowadays is just so fucking shitty, they really stand out,
So
for
I'll
being,
give I'll give Tyler the right to reply on Samoth, but you have actually touched on a thesis that I have on gatekeeping, and I'll try to be brief about it. But do you want to bat for Samoth at all, Tyler? Or
Yeah, you're wrong, Jason. Anyway, so no, I actually do roughly agree with you. I like Samoth more than you. So I guess the way that I could put it that to me still gives credit to their quality is that if they were releasing the same quality of albums as they are now in the 80s and 90s, they would not be as noticeable. I would still like them if I happened to come across them and still like them quite a bit, but they would not be as noticeable as they are now, because nowadays about the only new albums that I truly get like a level of excitement for beyond just, oh, this is good in comparison to what's coming out at the time, not probably going to listen to it again, is a Samoth album. I hear a new Samoth album comes out and I'm pretty enthusiastic about it.
hmm,
That might be
what?
about the only one
No,
for
I was
me.
just about to deviate and ask both of you guys, what about Mephitis? If that came out in like
I knew you were
1990.
gonna
I
fucking
don't like
say that.
Mephitis at
I
all.
knew you were gonna fucking say that
Okay? I
because
hope
you
that
wrote
If
friends are
that
that if
fucking
that
listening.
came
article.
if that
You
came
wrote
out
that
in
fucking article on
1991,
Embedon.
I would have
You're fucking
disliked it
5
just as
years
much.
after Embedon. What is the state like nowadays? I saw your fucking article, and you actually call out like people of the underground not giving it the attention it deserves, and all that shit.
It
Like,
got too much
I
attention.
mean, Shelley is the Mephitis, as Tyler is the Samath.
I know, right? And like Jason is like weirdly in like agreement and disagreement with either of us, depending on which band's being discussed.
okay, all I was going to ask is if Ember Dawn was released in like 91 or 92,
Demolick would have blown it out of the water, dude.
Dem
100%
yeah, all right.
outstrips it by
I,
vast spaces.
I'm not saying Mephitis outstripped Demolick, but Demolick is like the most like the absolute like left field example you could have used, like one of the weirdest death metal albums ever released, not just in like the early 90s or whatever. But now you know what? Never mind. Let's not labor this point because I actually wanted to move on to what Jason was saying, particularly around the idea of like again, I'm using the jock diluting the thrash scene as like a good sort of metaphor for the, sort of what happens more broadly in metal. So to develop Jason's point around the fact that metal is no longer a viable kind of living organism, I would say like roughly from about the mid 70s to maybe the late 90s, metal had like a very coherent story arc as kind of a form of art in that you have, I'm not going to rehearse the history of metal, but you have the development of it, then you have this acceleration as the 80s proceed, and then you have this blossoming into all of these different weird and wonderful directions in the early 90s, and then by the late 90s it had kind of run its course and kind of run out of steam, and it kind of entered this sort of wilderness by the early 2000s. And people sort of say, oh, by the late 2000s, early 2010s, it kind of undergone this renaissance. But I would say it's kind of a zombie existence because it's not just the nostalgia aspect of it, but you also get a lot of quote unquote newer fans that resurrect different aspects of metal and meld it together in different sort of forms of genre, alchemy, and so on, and kind of combine post rock with post metal and black metal, and you get black gaze or elements of indie music or elements of electronica, and you get these weird industrial offshoots and stuff. And it's always like an amalgamation. There's not been any sort of genuine new development within the underlying structure of how metal is constructed compared to like the shift from heavy metal through to death metal and black metal, which was a profound change in the way that people fucking played the guitar or people played the drums. Like you look at the way that black metal, particularly in Norway, developed, and Euronymous and Snore from Fawns kind of developed this genuinely new technique for playing guitar in a metallic setting and stuff. And that kind of development hasn't happened for a long time. But metal is more populous than it has ever been. There are more people that claim to be into metal. There are probably more metal bands than there have ever been in history, and more metal releases put out. And when you kind of decry that and say this might actually be a bad thing, that is when you start getting accused of gatekeeping. And this is where the conflation comes, because it's not me saying you're not entitled to like metal. Anyone that wants to like metal and anyone that does like metal is obviously entitled to like it. Like I couldn't stop them even if I wanted to. But it's this misunderstanding or misapplication or partial reading of metal's history that I have a problem with, where they don't quite understand where the music came from and how it developed, is what I'm trying to get at, I guess.
Yeah, I completely agree. And there's one symptom that's very fucking obvious of where a band loses, credibility, I would say, at least in my eyes. You look at even like the early Metallica, we were casting shade on their fan base, but they still had quote unquote narrative song structures and all that. But it was really like when like hard rock influences started entering into metal, where you have like verse chorus structures and all of that, where it becomes very predictable and it becomes like just wallpaper to me personally, like the vibe out on. That's when metal, like extreme metal, the type of metal that we really love, death and black metal, that's where, when bands start emulating the verse chorus stuff that is obviously lended from hard rock music, that's when it really starts losing its credibility in my eyes. Like you look at a new Hypocrisy album or Amon Amarth or anything like that, that people lop the shit out of those fucking, bands. And you look at the actual musical content, it's very straightforward. It's constructed just like pop songs are. And they could have, maybe a compelling riff or here and there, but when it comes to the overall experience, there's definitely they're just lopping up fucking shit. Like there's nothing there that is like an overarching structure to the song's construction other than just being pleasant on the ears. And if you want to hear pleasant on the ears, listen to hard rock. So that's my interpretation of at least one symptom of the downfall of extreme metal, where it becomes too palatable, it becomes too audience friendly, and the people who tend to champion that stuff are people who tend to really not think about metal that deeply. They'll and they do enjoy the hard rock aspects that are in bands like that. So and I view those people as quote unquote posers, but that's a value judgment right there. And I was told by one professor not to throw my value judgments in the face of the public, but obviously I've done that a thousandfold already. But that's my interpretation of when extreme metal really lost its spirit is the influx of people who just have the wrong like perception. And when I say wrong, like not the it's not the same spirit of what the originators had, where it was difficult music. It was challenging the individual. All these things that you listen to a Sandmouth album like Godless Arrogance, one of the most unpleasing fucking aesthetic experiences out there, but it just fucking works. Once you're able to get into, you realize like how all the components form this cohesive whole, and it becomes a special experience. So a lot of the vast majority of bands out there today, especially the more popular bands, and as well as a lot of the legacy acts, they tend to adopt that easy listening verse chorus. Oh yeah, the audience will like this. They'll vibe out to it for a couple of weeks, and that'll be it. Like even when we had Dauber Beverly on here, he was talking about the short lifespans of releases because it is a consumer's fucking product. People get into it for a week or two, and then they move on to the next thing, and they don't really have the type of approach where they listen to music, which is art, and they just move on to the next thing. Where true art that challenges the individual requires a lot of time to be spent with it to really grasp everything that's in it. That's roughly my interpretation of it. Sorry if I stumbled around. I am drinking some Shiner Box because it is 100 Necropolis episodes. We are celebrating. We made it to 3 fucking digits. Okay, Shelly, go ahead. I know you want to talk about fucking trade unions and shit.
No,
Does your
it's
thoughts
Tyler's
copy?
gonna go. Tyler's gonna go next, and then I'll talk about. Well, I'm not going to talk about trade unions, but Tyler.
Yeah, I have some thoughts that I would like to both of your opinions on uh, in commenting on pretty much a lot of the things that both of you have been saying. So Jason brought up that metal shot its creative load in a specific time period. You could say the late 80s to early 90s, and the Satanic Panic was mentioned, and so on and so forth. And so this is one of the, I guess you could say, two questions that I wanted to pose to you both. Do you think that is so much a temporal issue, which I do think that is part of the equation, or
Of
more
course, it's
so,
part of the ephemerality of it.
right? But the what I wanted to add to that was, is it also could it also perhaps be that, and this plays into what you were saying, really, that at that time, Satan as a symbol of rebellion was culturally relevant. Metal still largely abides by that satanic imagery, but I would ask if that satanic imagery is no longer culturally relevant as a symbol of rebellion, and perhaps if metal wanted to be culturally relevant, not in the sense that it's accepted in the mainstream, but in the sense that it actually uh, challenged society the way it did in that time period, if it would need to adopt a different mythology. And then the other question I
Okay.
had was we were talking about mainstream music, the mainstreamification of metal, which I agree with, that happened. I almost wonder though if it could be said that the peak of what you could, if you were to strictly define mainstream metal by, as a few random examples, music like Amon Amarth, Mastodon, which are still popular in a sense. Um, I wonder if that kind of metal though has kind of had its peak as far as its the height of its popularity, because I would say that a malaise that you see in metal today extends far beyond just mainstream style metal bands. You see it in the new wave of old school death metal, which in my opinion, and I don't necessarily mean this as a compliment, imitates the aesthetic of old school death metal very well, but it's almost entirely insubstantial as music. I wonder if that part of this issue is that the format of metal, so to speak, has become standardized, and because it's become standardized, it's easy to imitate by people who don't have the analytical capability or perhaps the intuition to understand the spirit of metal that can only really be communicated as an experience, not as a formula that can be verbalized in some way. So I don't know if you guys have any thoughts on those points.
I have many thoughts, so I will try and be brief. In terms of metal being a product of a specific historical context, if friend of the channel David Burke was here, he would say that metal is a particular product of like a post-industrial Western kind of context, i.e., bands like Black Sabbath, Judas Priest, Diamond Head, and stuff all arose in like industrial areas in the UK, but at their absolute decline, and it developed throughout the 80s as like the Thatcher and Reagan era kind of really got going, and you get this kind of acceleration of extremity, and that's not just true of metal. That's true of like Arnold Schwarzenegger action films and video games, and like the acceleration of a lot of different things. Metal was kind of a product of that, and there are certain arms of the underground that we particularly take an interest in that really kind of developed that into a very unique form of expression that I think partially was also a product of the Cold War in a lot of ways. And although black metal, yes, it has its roots in the 80s, but it kind of gained artistic maturity, for want of a better word, in the 90s, is still very much a Cold War kind of phenomenon. To your point on, I've completely forgotten what I was going to say, but it will come to me very quickly. Jason, go ahead. Oh no, he's gone for a piss. Never mind.
Jason is he's having technical issues, so
He's having technical issues. Oh, okay.
we can riff off this idea for a few moments.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to remember what I was about to say. Yeah, the idea of Satanism in particular. So in the 80s, yeah, we mentioned the Satanic Panic a few times, and Nancy Reagan, Tipper Gore, and so on, who formed this kind of really convenient kind of common enemy for alternative culture at large. It wasn't just metal that was targeted by the Satanic Panic. You had fucking Cyndi Lauper and Prince that were also targeted. But it was a really kind of unique moment where metal was able to align itself with counterculture, but also metal has always been sort of distinct and separate from the broader counterculture. I'm kind of talking about the vestiges of what we could loosely call hippie music or whatever, but it was still very much alive within contemporary music of the mid to late 80s, where it's broadly liberally, socially liberal, left leaning, and very, very kind of permissive. Metal has always been a little bit restrictive in that sense because in its origins, it was a very white, male, heterosexual dominated art form, although, obviously it has a sort of gay undercurrents and stuff, but that was always a subtext. It was never a text. Whereas I think if you track the evolution of that particular theme within metal, I think the new atheists of the mid 2000s, I'm talking Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, people like that, is actually a really interesting turning point, because I remember being online at that point and on a lot of metal forums where they were really discussing Richard Dawkins really hard and saying like, no, this is a really interesting thinker, and the way he's challenging religion, all religions, not just Christianity, and kind of going at it hard with logic and sort of owning them, to use the vernacular, kind of struck hard with a lot of metalheads. Whereas now I see a weird alignment of broadly liberal, progressive, sort of permissive cultural streams saying, actually, that was really kind of ugly what happened there. Religion is, yeah, we might not be religious ourselves, but if we want, we don't have anything against religious people and we should live and let live. And that kind of has seeped into metal to some extent, where you do get not necessarily a celebration of Christianity, but it's not critical of Christianity. It appropriates the images, it appropriates the language, the iconography, the concepts, but in a much more kind of descriptive way rather than a critical way. You go from say like the Ruins of Beverast, which is very, very keen on sort of doing these vast concept journeys about Christianity, but it will never sort of say, by the way, I hate this. Whereas like 20 years prior, you'd have Deicide, which is, we hate this. By the way, here's kind of what it is. It's like there's a very stark contrast there, which yeah, it's just a thought that kind of occurred to me as you were speaking about Christianity in particular, Tyler. But I'm not sure if that makes sense. But
No, it makes perfect sense, and I think I roughly agree with your analysis of the attitude of metal towards Christianity and how it's developed over time in tandem with the development of progressive attitudes towards religion. I also think, however, that while I am somewhat posing the question, is Satanism outdated in heavy metal music and at large in society? That some of the most interesting metal bands today, and this is also keeping in mind the fact that they're interesting partly because of the context of what other metal is being released, are the ones that kind of hang on to an aggressive anti-Christianity, whether they do so explicitly in the case of something like Imprecation, or whether they don't do so explicitly, but that's the milieu they associate with as far as shows they play and people they know personally, like Samoth. Um, because and that may have to do with the Satanism, or it may have to do with the extremism, because maybe they more so align with the new atheist movement, like in the form of Richard Dawkins and whatnot in this, but the extremism of them, I think, kind of would balk at the idea of not accepting Christianity but allowing it to exist. I feel like if they're going to take that almost hyperbolic attitude that metal often has in a lot of its imagery, they would insist that there should be a hatred for Christianity. And there's various reasons as to why that I think range all over the board, from progressive to a form of, I wouldn't say political conservative, but perhaps existential conservative, and disliking things that are weak. Um,
yeah, it's interesting because the like progressives want to say like we live in a rational world, we're science based, and Christianity is fundamentally conservative. But equally, they're very, very liberal in that they want to say, well, no, if there is a rich tradition tied to Christianity, communities form around it, and also we believe that people should have the freedom to choose how they want to exercise, their spiritual life or whatever. And that's always kind of metal has always been quite challenging to that because it is very, very it's a blunt axe. And again, I'm referencing Deicide as like the ultimate satanic band, but we could talk about Profanatica, we could talk about Morbid Angel to some extent, we could talk about any Gorgoroth, we could talk about any number of extreme metal bands in particular that are overtly um, Satanist or anti-Christian in some way. And I think what you're kind of grasping at is the pantheon or the kind of mythology that metal draws on in the last 15 to 20 years has vastly expanded, and that's partly because metal has vastly expanded the geography of its reach. So you do get bands from outside of Christian countries or Christian societies who are, some of them have done some genuinely interesting things, who are calling on other pantheons or other religious traditions to kind of, mesh with metal. But at the same time, you get this uncomfortable undercurrent of, is metal criticizing Christianity because it's weak, or is it criticizing it because it's oppressive, or is it criticizing it because it's anti-democratic, conservative, too progressive, or there's a whole like milieu of contradictions going on there. Whereas I think you do touch on something when you say like bands that are just kind of classically Satanist. Imprecation is a great example, and yeah, Sam of like they released an album called Godless Arrogance, which although the album Samoth more recently have been about war and the nihilism and chaos and destruction caused by war in a way that echoes someone like Bolt Thrower. They're pretty explicit in the fact that this is godless, in that we've forgotten, Europe has forgotten its moral compass in that sense, and that is largely
It's
tied
very
to this.
Nietzschean.
Yeah,
the
yeah,
tagline for Across the Rhine is Only Death was, "There is no place for your God here."
exactly. Yeah,
Right. Now, what I know, you just mentioned a lot of different factors that could be considered. What the elements that made extreme metal, thrive, such as Satanism, as being a rejection of popular culture at the time. But I'm not sure if you guys said this. I ran downstairs to get batteries real quick for my mixer. Um, there is an element to extreme metal, especially that I think most people who are in it, they're very invested in it. They do view it as something larger than the individual. And there is this very idealistic approach to extreme metal, which is probably why we're on the same page with our value judgments, because we probably all still, at least this group here, we probably still have the idealism in our approach to, well, this very powerful expression of music that obviously is completely opposite from, mainstream culture. Like the closest thing it is to is like nature, like just the uncaring aspect of nature, where it's this long line of predation in the food chain. Um, and there's reverence for that. And I feel that people who get into extreme metal, and it really resonates with them, they tend to be idealistic. And what I think a lot of the bands who tend to espouse very progressive views, they tend to not acknowledge the idealism in extreme metal. And I know, just from personal experience meeting, Marxists. I know, Shelley, you're an outlier, but they tend to really shy away from anything idealistic, because that's
So,
when you do have concepts of uh, purity and traditionalism and
well, just to
um,
clarify, could you maybe elaborate on what you mean by idealistic in this context?
idealistic, as in so we could look at the empirical aspects of extreme metal, and we can like that a lot. Just the sheer force of it, the like David Burke has said. I saw him say in one interview that it's one of the few forms of music that affects you viscerally. I apologize for that. I've had a few beers, but um, because the amps are so fucking loud, and everything's going through monitors and all that, and just the sheer volume of the music affects you empirically, your body there in time and space. Your physical body is affected by extreme metal, and that's what I think a lot of people on the left are tend to they're drawn to extreme metal because of that aspect. Whereas I think there's a higher form of approach to extreme metal where you do see beauty beyond the physical component of just being loud and very scary and monstrous and all that, and using broad adjectives, because we're getting into the fucking atmosphere of extreme metal, a different philosopher and all that. But I do view that there's this type of idealism where people view it as larger than life, that they approach it and they think that this is something that isn't encountered in everyday reality. It's something that's greater than life. Is I know I've said that a few times. I'm sorry for being redundant, but it's something larger that it has special purpose beyond the empirical aspects of
No, I think
the sheer volume.
sorry to interrupt, Jason, but I think you are onto something there in that the people I encounter that I think again, this isn't me attacking anyone. I think they're acting in perfect good faith and they're coming from a place where they understand that I'm sort of trying to meet them in the middle. But the reason why when they encounter metal and they might be unfamiliar with it, but they are familiar with other forms of extreme alternative music, harsh industrial noise, electronica, whatever. Um, the reason why they're attracted to things like black metal is because black metal foregrounds the texture so explicitly, and that's kind of why things like post metal, post black metal, like various forms of sludge and post sludge, like the ancestors of Neurosis and bands like that, have become quite so popular, is because it is that sort of textural experience that people are after. And I've seen a lot of bands like that live, and it is very powerful. It's a physical experience, and I've enjoyed a lot of it. But when I sit down with the headphones on, that there is something missing, and that thing that is missing is, I think, what you're talking about when you refer to the idealism, in that the when you listen to, say, a classic Immortal song, it has that visceral element to it, but there is a complexity and a nuance and
There's
a
more. There's more. And what I meant to
dynamism
say is,
to it. But
yeah, there's an element of transcendentalism to it. And that's why what I think I meant by idealism. There's an element of transcendentalism. There's the element of purity. There's the element of honest expression, authenticity, all of that into an idealistic form of expression. And what I really meant to say was transcendental. And transcendental does kind of go hand in hand with idealism. So that's what I meant to say was, like in classical music, I know I mentioned that a lot, but
oh no, we
I
got 55 minutes in. That's a record. That is a record.
I wasn't going to mention a specific composer or anything, just that one of my favorite things about seeing a classical music performance live is sitting right up front and in the orchestra pit drinking some beers if the venue allows it. Many don't nowadays, but getting a good buzz going and just letting the music just take me, absorb. My mind's faculties are completely absorbed by the forms of music, and yeah, the volume, and especially experiencing it in person is better than it being replicated on a CD. Where yeah, I do kind of view Salbadaccia's view of the recorded form, the age of uh, reproduction of just mass reproduction of CDs and all that. It's very sterile, but uh, there is a transcendental experience in that when you, especially very profound music, and I think metal can be very profound, and the profound aspects, whether it be low hanging fruit, like knuckleheaded bands like Gutted, or like really abstract bands like Morbid Angel with a lot of abstract patterns and riff forms and all of that. It can be a middle brow to high brow, and within its own medium. Now, it's a different subject of whether metal is highbrow or not. I
Oh,
think we
don't get
butted
Jason
heads
started on the
that,
brows, man.
Well, yeah, I was going to say, I have something else to introduce, but before I do, Tyler, do you have anything else? Do you have any thoughts on what Jason just said?
I have some thoughts on something that you said, although it's kind of
Okay.
another can of worms, which is you were talking about people being interested in black metal because of its foregrounding of the texture. And the examples you brought up as a result of that were sludge, post metal, black gaze, or post black metal. Um, do we want to talk about the common denominator of all of those examples that you listed and several others of post hardcore, and how all of those genres suspiciously sound like they were made by people who used to be into post hardcore?
Well, I would, but I'm not familiar enough with post-hardcore other than just a sense that I
I
get from
could
certain
use the
people.
term punk too, but every time I bring that example up, somebody wants to needle it and be like, "Oh, you're saying that punk is the common denominator of bad metal? Do you like DRI?" Um,
Well, that's
so
punk is a very broad term right now. Like, it can cover everything from like DRI and Amoebics and Cro-Mags to fucking Newfound Glory. Like,
yeah, exactly. And like they're like dropping some implication that if I think that DRI is okay, I should think Job for a Cowboy is okay. And clearly those are two very different things, and they're kind of
so
creating a
I
false
thought Job for a
equivalency there.
Cowboy was deathcore, but again, I'm showing my ignorance here. In
Yeah, it
fact,
is deathcore, but being deathcore, I would say that in some
yeah.
sense you could consider it a punk-derived genre.
So what I wanted to ask actually was kind of related to this, and you could bring post-hardcore into it, but I am not, because I'm not au fait with that genre. But I I don't know if you recently read my review of. I read a book recently called Evolution of the Cult by Dale Patterson, published on what's the fucking Cult is Alive, whatever. And I went into it with like a lot of grains of salt, I was like, this is probably going to be quite a sort of frustrating read. And what I got was kind of like a history of black metal that was a mile wide and an inch deep. He is a journalist that has been working in black metal since the mid 90s. He has interviewed all of the kind of main characters of black metal that are still with us. So there is a vast kind of body of material that he draws on. So as a kind of extended magazine, an archive of the history of black metal, it is a good read. And I was kind of fine. So he's gone through like the obvious history of it from predictably Venom, but we can sort of set that aside for now. All the way through the 80s, Bathory, Merciful Fate, Mayhem, goes through the Norwegian scene, goes through the Greek scene, goes to more kind of the late 90s territory. None of it, some of it you find a bit predictable and you kind of raise your eyebrows at, but none of it is kind of frustrating. And then I expected the last chapter to be, and by the way, the future of black metal is liturgy and death heaven. But instead he does an about turn and says, like, not fuck those bands, because he has a great deal of respect for those bands, but he says fuck the guys or the people that came into black metal and tried to tell the black metal scene that these bands were the future of black metal, something that the members of Liturgy and Death Heaven have actively tried to distance themselves from. They have publicly said, like, we actually don't want to be associated with black metal. We take influence from it, sure, but we take influence from Oasis, but no one would compare us to Oasis. We are just our own thing, and we don't want to be part of that thing. But there are so many kind of journalists from the likes of Vice, Louder Sound, and so on that tried, particularly in the mid 2010s, to try to say that black metal was a very backward-looking, traditionalist, purist scene because they would not accept these newer bands as their chosen future. And Patterson actually draws a really interesting comparison when he says, like, the Clash, who were, obviously one of the formative punk bands, they took a turn to sort of reggae by about 1980, and that would be the equivalent of everyone sort of marching into the reggae scene and saying, look, the Clash, they're the future of reggae music, and if you don't like it, you're a gatekeeper. And like, that would be highly problematic. And he sort of says people have been doing the same thing with Liturgy and Death Heaven to the black metal scene. It's like these bands say they take influence from it and they do their own thing, but for all of these other, I don't know what to call them, but other music fans to sort of march into the black metal scene and say, oh, you're just an elitist gatekeeper because you don't like Liturgy and Death Heaven, even though those bands themselves are saying we're just influenced by black metal, we're not the future of the genre. I know, obviously, Hunter Hendricks wrote that essay back in the day, but I think she's sort of tried to walk herself back from that more recently. And I've actually read some really intelligent interviews with her lately, which are far more kind of thoughtful and kind of aware of the complexities of the black metal scene. But I found it a really kind of interesting dissection of how gatekeeping almost comes full circle and people try to. It's almost like a feedback loop of gatekeeping, where gatekeepers a gate kept from their
There's
own
a
genre
meme
in
that
a way.
addresses this. Actually, it is actually the subject was like tabletop role playing, but I think the four panels were: first panel, people enjoying a hobby; second panel, somebody says, "Hey, can I join your hobby?" People say, "Sure." Third panel, um, I don't think that like your hobby is inclusive enough. Why are you excluding us? Fourth panel, that person making that complaint has said, "Hey, since I don't consider you inclusive enough, you are now excluded."
Well, yeah, that's almost it.
Okay, I have a point to make. Where you're talking about, there are a lot of people in the extreme metal scene who do want it to be very inclusive environment where everything, it's rather politically correct, I should say. Like I've seen some festivals, like what was it, the Northwest Terror Fest or something like that, where they actually state that no bigots allowed, essentially. And extreme metal that I am accustomed to has always been very antisocial. Like you look at our favorite bands, and a lot of them really did express very antisocial ideals. Like it may not just be using Satanism as counterculture and all that, but they could just be antisocial people, like psychologically speaking. They could be, like cutting yourself up on stage just to keep the wimps at bay. That's
Oh,
Well, you
that.
only have to look
when you're
at Glenn
talking about,
Benson's.
Yeah,
yeah,
So I was going to say, you
yeah,
only
I
have
mean,
to look at Glenn
there's
Benson's recent pronouncements on like metal bands looking like Weezer, and to be honest, I
right,
kind of agree with him. Like,
right.
so.
I mean, and when you're
Um,
talking about
but
black
it
metal
goes
in
on. It goes
particular,
on. Like
like,
MKM from Antaeus used to cut himself up really badly on stage.
yeah,
And there was just a lot of antisocial behavior. And in the early days, I know at one point in time there was a lot of skinheads who came into the extreme metal scene in like the early '90s, and that was just short lived. I go to the extreme metal show nowadays. May see some people on the far right, but they're not like full fledged skins or anything. They may just have read Evola or Renee Guénon, and they feel like empowered by text such as that. But the I don't really see like true skinheads even at well, I saw like a couple of skinheads at Steelfest, but nothing like that I felt was like truly, like a movement or anything. Just a few outliers, but even what I was trying to say is back in the early '90s, there were some bands who did express, some Nazi views just to be controversial and antisocial. Like, I don't truly believe those individuals really knew what National Socialism was and all that entailed. And I don't believe they truly understood, the true history of Nazi Germany and all that. I just think they adopted that imagery to scare fucking people. And so I think another element that we've kind of neglected is the antisocial aspect of extreme metal, which is very antisocial. Now we talk about in a social setting here on the podcast. We go to shows which are very social, but the genuine expression. Look at Varg Vikernes. There's no one on this planet, who can deny that. That's a very highly antisocial person.
well,
Very
yeah, I mean, like that early Norwegian black metal scene outright said explicitly, almost verbatim, that part of the reason that they make their music as extreme as it is, like texturally with the production quality and the vocal style, and insisting on standard tuning instead of drop tuning, and throwing animal parts at shows and cutting themselves, is because if somebody isn't the kind of person who intuitively gets the kind of music they're creating, they want them to be scared away. They don't want them there, which
Yeah,
is like,
exactly. So yeah, I think we also have to factor in that at least the birth of extreme metal was a very antisocial expression. It was created by a lot of individuals who were antisocial. Now, a lot of them have backpedaled on that, and they've reached monetary gain with their expressions. Now, we can
well,
segue into a Das Kapital with Shelly
no,
here.
no, no,
So
no.
go ahead.
I'm not gonna do that just yet. But I was gonna say, like, one of the interesting things about what you're saying is, if people want, like, if you're listening to Burzum, like, you don't have to be an idiot to understand that it's deliberately visceral and extreme and quite abrasive. And to be surprised at the idea that the guy that made it is actually really, really unpleasant is strikes me as very, very naive. Now, I understand that that comes with a lot of problems in terms of um, I don't really want to go down the rabbit hole of, you know, artists and the morality of how we consume art and so on. I think that's probably a separate episode in itself. But the fact that a lot of newer people have entered extreme metal and kind of expected it to conform to very sort of communal, um, cooperative kind of values, using those terms in very sort of a broad context deliberately. Whereas sort of extreme metal back in the day, yeah, there was obviously mutual cooperation. Otherwise, it wouldn't have really got off the ground as a scene. You know, you have to put on gigs, you have to promote, you have to publish zines, you have to do tape trade and so on. You have to do what it takes, and there was a lot of love there. But there was also a lot of healthy competition, and sometimes that bred into outright like obnoxiousness. I mean, I was just saying before we started recording, I was at Brutal Assault in the Czech Republic a couple of weeks ago, and I watched Deicide, and they played an hour-long set, and I think for the entire hour, Glenn Benton said 5 words, and it was just "thank you very much for having us" or something. And I think that's because Glenn Benton is sometimes such a problematic character, and when he gets so worked up, he can say stuff that is very, very cancelable. That he was just, no, we're just gonna do the music and leave, because if I say anything more or say what's on my mind, I might just attract the ire of someone. And that struck me as quite funny, because it's like, well, I've just listened to an hour of some of the most aggressive, powerful, primal, visceral music I've ever heard. And then for someone to expect this guy to stand up and say something polite and inclusive strikes me as a little bit comedic in a way.
Yeah, and
Go ahead, Tyler.
good one.
Right. What's your thunk? You have thunk?
I have a thunk on this. So I brought up the punk music. I tried to be more specific by addressing post-hardcore as a common denominator of later developments in metal responding to elements that they liked about it while also being critical about elements that they didn't like and kind of trying to dictate what metal should be. So, I mean, this punk is a very broad phenomenon, just like rock is a very broad phenomenon. There's all sorts of exponents of what that music it is and what you could say it means. But in a sense, I think it's inarguable that at least a major part of the history of punk, if not perhaps the majority of it, is social criticism, criticizing things about society that they disagree with or that they find morally objectionable. And there's also an outcast element, but I think that outcast element kind of hinges on the social criticism. We are outcasts because we disagree with something that most of society does, or the establishment does, or so on and so forth, whatever target they're attacking, class,
Right.
politicians.
David Burke would say that metal is comprised of losers, and what he means by that, he means it in social terms, like extreme metal people. They're not really out there to get the fancy cars and the biggest tittied women or well-be titted women. They're out there to get just the whatever metal
Excuse me, I
expression
think you're
out
a
there.
well-betuted woman. What can I buy you a
Yeah.
drink?
Well, yeah, and that's part of my point is that in the punk perspective, so to speak, there's almost an implied sense of resentment. I don't want to be an outcast. I simply am as a result of the fact that I'm critical of mainstream society in some way or another. And so outcast art for me is simply a means of having the community that I wish I had in society at large, if society at large was right, and however you want to define right, inclusive, progressive, diverse, whatever is their moral philosophy. I'm not commenting on the correctness or incorrectness of it. Um, so then going back to what Jason was talking about looking at metal as a transcendental experience or just enjoying the, perhaps you could say, surface level elements. Um, I wonder if you could say that the metal that is the gatekeeping metal, the metal that the later developments in metal music were critical of and said that it wasn't inclusive or that it needed to change, didn't see itself as a sort of alternative community simply as a regrettable result of the fact that they're critical of society, but they didn't want to be part of society in the first place. It's not they're not trying to critique society. They're almost looking at it as, I'm not entirely sure how to define it. I suppose you could draw perhaps a loose analog to a religious experience, like in the sort of what you have when listening to well composed religious music, where it almost is supposed to serve a ritual function. Um, they're a kind of worshiping something. It may not be a deity. You could say, as I think Jason actually
No,
alluded
what you
to.
mean, Tyler, what you mean is there's certainly a ritual to
Yeah,
metal.
it's like they're
And that's what,
worshiping almost like you could say like power, and power not just in the sense of I'm dominating others and conforming them to my will, but power in the sense of like they see mountains for Immortal, for example, as powerful. Mountains don't have morals. you know, they're not
Lord
trying to
Byron, can I say, obviously I love the song Mountains of Might, and we've already touched upon that as Shelley's saying that was probably the beginning of the decline. But Lord
Right.
Byron said, high mountains aren't a place, they are a feeling. That's what Lord Byron said.
Yeah, and actually, I'm glad that Shelley just said that he has thoughts because I'm interested in hearing both of your opinions on this, but I'm really interested in hearing what Shelley has to say.
Yeah, sorry. Again, it's one of these things where I'll try and be brief, but I have quite broad thoughts. So, again, the what we would generally call authentic metal arises out of quite nihilistic circumstances. So going all the way again, all the way back to Black Sabbath, they grew up in a very deprived area of Birmingham, which is a very industrial town, and they kind of, they grew up in the hippie era, and they're developing this form of like classic rock blues or whatever into what we kind of understand as kind of the lexicon of of metal, sorry. But it is under the shadow of these huge steel factories and huge kind of mills and so on, where you get this huge smog, and the streets they live in are very grey and miserable. And I don't know if you've well, Jason has been to the UK, but it rains a lot here. It's very, very damp and it's very, very wet. And similarly, uh, Tampa, Florida, we often say, there might be something in the water over there, but it was part of the Bible Belt. I know the Bible Belt is quite a large geographical span of like the US, but there is a reason why those bands arrived at this particular time in the US because yeah, there was kind of already the infrastructure and the scene already there, but it was a very conservative Christian place, and it's no wonder that bands like Deicide and Morbid Angel and so on arose out of in that context. And again, bringing it forward to black metal, Norway is a very, very wealthy, very, very stable, very, very boring place to live. And yeah, a lot of the sort of members of the Black Circle, they weren't particularly wealthy at this time, but they were very, very bored, and they were deprived. They didn't have social media or the internet, and they didn't have all of the sort of distractions that we have today. But they did have the sort of the profundity of Norwegian nature that Tyler made reference to in what he was saying, and that's kind of where you get this kind of intersection of the experience of your environment with this ability to express something beyond itself. And I think that's what punk kind of lacks. And I would say that's with the exception of a band like Amoebics, who I think that's one of the reasons why I love them so much, because they managed to mesh the kind of the magic or the mystique of their environment with the energy of punk music. But that's why metal has always been far more communicative in that sense, because it is so much more a sort of broad reaching and profound in that sense. And I think that is one of the reasons why metal today is sort of failing for me in a way, because um, the other counter narrative to what metal was doing is there's a lot of music, pop music generally, but there's a lot of other genres that are primarily about self-expression. And again, I'm going to qualify what I'm saying. I don't have anything against music that is about self-expression. Sometimes I'm depressed, sometimes I'm sad, sometimes I'm going through bad things, and I just want to listen to a song, a pop song or whatever, that is like chimes with my sadness and gives me a bit of catharsis. I completely understand that, but the reason why I listen to metal is because the experience is far broader. But in the mid 2000s onwards, you kind of get this meshing of the two, where people say, "Oh, let's take the kind of profundity and the sort of macro experience of metal and start meshing it with the emotional catharsis of the more kind of profound aspects of indie music." Post rock, sort of post metal, is where this kind of is sort of the ground zero of where this kind of takes place, but it's kind of spun off into a lot of different genres by this point.
I
When
mean,
you
Napalm Death has a song about hating their landlords, so
yeah, but in the UK, landlord is way more of a slur than it is in the US, I believe. Like that, being a landlord in the UK is quite a shameful thing to be, which is why you get Napalm Death saying, yeah, writing a song about being a landlord, but it's not controversial here. Like landlords are, uh, it's kind of like saying someone is a, I don't know, a pig or something. Anyway, yeah, I think I'd sort of drawn my thoughts to a close. Jason, what are your thoughts?
well, I certainly agree that yeah, going back to like the hard rock influences just taking over metal. Of course, rock music. I know you're going to say not all rock music, but a good 99.99999999999% of rock
You
music is
cunt.
about self-expression, and that has definitely seeped into, especially social media of bands posting, like really like everyday happenings, and it's like, oh yeah, this is my persona that I want to put out there, and yeah, I understand like w- get into the commercial side of it. They do have an audience where they have to cater to that aspect, and it's sad. It's sad where like you said, they're operating as like small business owners, and they have to keep up the happenings in that regard to stay relevant, and that's horrible. I wish bands would just write good music and not have anything to do like JD Salinger. I know Tyler, you love like Catcher in the Rye, right? Like JD Salinger, he got really into Advaita Vedanta. He wrote a book, and he did not give a shit about personal accolades or anything like that. He actually said like put it in a safe and release it 50 years after I'm dead, and then it'll come out. And it's like that's what bands should do. Like if you want to do your magnum opus, just release it 50 years after you're dead. Like don't care about what the current climate is in a society where it's all about the individual and their expression. If you're honest and have a genuine, authentic expression, doesn't matter personally if you benefit from that. As long as it gets put out there, I understand that bands definitely could lose motivation by not receiving any type of reciprocation from their art out there in the public space. So I understand like it's kind of a double-edged sword in that type of situation. But I really think like what I want to do with GoCraft moving forward, not necessarily GoCraft, but just my piano music in general, is really, and I know I have a different take on ephemerality than Tyler does, but just to work on a piece really hard, perform it once for a group of people, and never play it again. And all that's left of that piece is in the memories of the people who experienced it. And when they're dead, it's gone forever. I think that is more beautiful than putting on a fucking CD that's mass produced, sent out there to the public, and lasts there forever. I think it's more personal, and then personal not in a, like a getting, reciprocation from the outside world to validate your identity or anything like that. What I mean is more honest expression. It's all about the art itself. And,
That's quite a Frank Zappa point of view. I think Glenn Gould would disagree, but I'm gonna hand to Tyler, and then I'm gonna just come back on one thing.
all right, I'm going to have a smoke while you guys, argue.
Hell yeah. Anyway, um, I feel that what with Jason talking about, I only had one comment. It's actually more kind of a jib than it is something that is a kind of a topic for discussion. A certain metal writer I read once said something along the lines of he wishes that wealthy aristocrats would pay to have talented metal bands sequestered in a monastery until they produce something good.
I mean, it depends what they mean by talented metal bands, but yeah, I'm down for that. I think that's what Black Sabbath did when they wrote Sabbath Bloody Sabbath, which is one of those albums where, like, yeah, the first three songs or so are quality. But anyway, sorry, I'm diverging. What I wanted to come in on is I know Jason's gone for a cigarette, so I might as well do it now. He keeps teasing me about Marxism, but the reason why I wanted to bring up not necessarily Marxism, but left-wing theory in this is because I do link the discourse around the anxiety around gatekeepers back to the idea that people treat their cultural consumption as a form of activism, and I don't want to like accuse anyone of anything because I do I'm just as guilty of this as anyone else, but I think that is because there has been a marked decline in the kind of means by which people can express activism through their workplace, specifically trade unionism, but also other sort of voluntary organizations as well. So that culture, and this is not just true of metal, this is true of geek culture in particular, but culture at large, but culture becomes a form of activism, and that's where you see the rise in identity politics, politics which ultimately just ends up in sort of Twitter arguments and social media spats and so on, which doesn't really resolve or solve anything. Whereas when you get sort of genuine labor disputes, you might get a pay rise or an improvement in terms and conditions. And this is where the kind of the decline in true kind of left-wing institutions does kind of pay relevance to something as banal as gatekeeping in metal, because people feel the need to call out gatekeepers online because it gives them a sense that they are doing something, they are being active, and they're calling out a cis white guy for being a bit mean about someone else's music tastes or whatever, and that's not really activism in the sense that I understand it as a left-wing activist. I'm doing all this while Jason is quickly having a cigarette so that he doesn't kind of butt in, but
Dos Capital, Dos
Oh, hell yeah. Shelley, on your point, I think that I actually almost wholeheartedly agree with you that that people criticize things like gatekeeping in lieu of any, I guess you could say, tangible form of activism. It's interesting that whenever I speak to an outspokenly progressive person, um, that when I talk to them about metal and as an example, recite some lyrics from Morbid Angel, Blasphemy, do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law, rebel against the church, drink from the chalice of blasphemy, rise up against the enslaver. The sentiment that I've had expressed to me multiple times from both progressive people who aren't metal fans and progressive people who are self-described metal fans is, I like the notion of rebelling against that institution if it's in the context of rebelling against it for oppressing victimized people. But I feel that there is an air of simply mocking Christianity for the joy of mocking Christianity, and I don't like that.
that's really telling as well, because it's one of these parodies that I always thought was like, oh, that's just a sort of right wing phantasm, but that thought police thing where people are genuinely starting to police their own thoughts and saying, can't you just revel in the idea of rebellion for its own sake, even as a concept? And I always, you draw comparisons with metal and horror films, or any film that expresses violence and power and abhorrent things. And the reason we watch them is because we want
People
to.
would say that's masculine traits. Neoliberals would say those are all
Well, I'm not.
masculine traits
I'm
that
not going to bring
should
the
be.
gender aspect to it just now because I don't have the energy and the wherewithal to discuss that. But uh, to take the horror and the gore aspect, people always say, films that explore those themes are relatively uncontroversial as far as like, oh, why do you like gore films? Because they're fun or whatever. And it's in within left wing thought, there's almost been a kind of taboo against exploring violence for the sake of violence, or anti ideological sentiments for their own sake. Whereas, like, no, there is value in exploring this, and you're not like depurifying yourself for the sake of kind of interacting with this. In fact, you're making yourselves stronger by doing so because you're exploring ideas that are counter to your own. Um, and yeah, there's that aspect to it, and there's also the idea that like um, people don't have any other outlet to express their political like persuasions, so they do impose them on things like as banal as like metal culture or whatever. Like the erosion of this sort of collective action has led to people doing things like policing, gatekeeping online, and so on, because yeah, they don't have any other sort of expression for all these values that are bubbling up inside them. And as a slightly older fan, like I completely sympathize, but at the same time, it's kind of I've engaged in genuine, concrete, boots on the ground political activism in the past, and then I've gone to a gig where I've been told off wearing a Burzum t-shirt, and I'm like, well, buddy, I was just knocking on doors for 4 hours for the Labour Party. What the fuck have you done? And it's this sense of policing your playground, which is essentially what they treat metal as. That kind of does irk me sometimes. Whereas like, and I guess it's true of any kind of form of identity politics is just gain some perspective. Like, yeah, there's a time and a place for that, but just understand your motivations for doing it, who you're talking to, and what actual difference, what tangible difference you're going to like impose on the world as a result of whatever you're calling out someone for.
Well, I think a lot of people are just fucking miserable and they want to inject their misery on a larger scale. And they can do that through, trying to police extreme metal and all that. Yeah, just make it. The thing about like really malignant, depressed people is they want everyone to be as miserable as they are. It's shitty, but that's they're like a benign, or not even benign. They're a cancerous tumor, and they want to spread their cancer around. That's my personal take on that. But yeah, there's a really interesting in the arts in general of how the I would say the not the highbrow left or the intellectual left, the way they approach art tends to be more through materialistic means than whereas having like idealism or a transcendental experience. There's a huge element of materialism there, and I'm trying to do this segue for you over and over and over for you to talk about trade unions, which you've yet to talk about.
That's not true. He did talk about it. You were
Oh, he
smoking a
did. I must have
cigarette.
been away for a second, but
Well, you just hinted at another segue where you mentioned highbrow again. Tyler, do you want
Well,
any comments on highbrow and lowbrow?
I mean highbrow as in lofty.
I
And
think that they are, how do I want to put this? Largely arbitrary distinctions. Like if someone were to ask me, do you think Beethoven is superior? Beethoven symphonies are superior music to Like an Ever-Flowing Stream by Dismember. Unhesitatingly, without even a set moment thought, I would say yes. Do I feel the need to label them as highbrow or middlebrow? No, I like them for different reasons, and there's
I mean,
times
there's
I
a
want to
layer of
listen to one or the other.
sophistication that definitely separates the two.
Right, like I said, I would unhesitatingly say yes, Beethoven symphonies are superior music to that album. But I still listen to them both, and I listen to them both for different reasons, because there's times that the experience of Like an Ever-Flowing Stream is the experience that I want to hear, and there's times that the experience of a symphony by Beethoven is the experience that I want to hear. But yeah.
And they are both cathartic in their own specific ways, right, Tyler?
Exactly. So yeah, that's my thoughts on the highbrow and the middlebrow and the lowbrow and the unibrow.
Yeah, I mean, when I trash guitar-based music, the other episode, I meant it more through that lens, and I tend to be a contrarian and antagonistic and all of that, very Nietzschean.
I
In
like
that
that about
regard.
you, though.
But I've always been that way. Even when I was a little kid, I was like that. But yeah, I mean, you raised some good points. Perhaps we shouldn't use those terms anymore because there's a level of profundity to both the Dismember and the Beethoven, but they're different types of profundities. And they can, they have their places within aesthetic experience. Now, if you were to tell me Job for a Cowboy is profound music, I would gatekeep the shit out of that and say, nope, you're a fucking poser. Get the fuck out of here. You're the trolley is going over you. I'm
If
sorry.
you are a false, do not
Don't
entry,
entry.
or you
Okay,
will be burned and died.
I've got one more way to frame the question because I sort of genuinely agree with the conclusion of your highbrow lowbrow thing. So, if we're talking about metal again, and we're saying, just I guess I'm going to be really kind of blunt and general here, but we're saying some people aren't doing it right, and it's not that we don't think that they're entitled to listen to it.
You have to
or
bring up
that-
Mephitis again. Holy
no,
shit.
I'm not going to bring up Mephitis
That's
again.
yeah,
Jesus
he
Christ.
did. He said some people aren't doing it right. That's clearly Mephitis. Like,
All right. Well, some people aren't doing it right. How do you listen to metal? So this is the point I want to draw out. It's a project I'm working on a separate video essay thing. But like, how does one listen to metal, or how should one listen to metal in order to garner the most kind of meaning or like experience from it? So, for instance, we keep
Or
making reference
reverence.
to.
How do you get reverence from metal, Shelley? I think
Well,
that's more.
yeah, okay. Well, maybe not reverence, because I think we need to be more precise with that what that word means. But like, um, I probably should have picked a song in order to sort of draw this point out. Let's just take a really generic example from.
Chapel of Ghouls.
Okay, Chapel of Ghouls. I was going to pick a Slayer song, but yeah, Chapel of Ghouls. Like, how do you listen to that in a way that sort of garners the most meaning? I don't. I'm not
I don't
asking.
think there's a single answer to I think
Yeah,
that
I'm not
because
asking in order
metal
for you
is
to say it in a way that, like, because it would be quite metallic and probably a little bit dry. But
I have a phenomenological reduction of it because I played it live with Browning. Mike
in
Browning.
broad brushstrokes, how do you approach a metal song? How do you listen to it? Because sometimes I present you guys with new albums, and you do come up with new perspectives that I was like, oh yeah, that's really interesting. I need to go back and listen to it again, whatever. Like newer metal. I'm talking about metal released in the last 5 years or whatever. And
I
you
think that
you
just like life, it's an ever expanding context. There's going to be times where the value, so to speak, that you derive from listening to metal is going to be more analytical, and there's going to be times that it's more emotional, perhaps, or intuitive. And both of those things are going to offer you. It's like looking at a statue from different angles. You're looking at the same statue, but it can look different depending upon what angle you're looking at, and that can reveal new facets of the experience of that art. So I think that there is no formulaic way to listen to metal correctly, so to speak. I think it's kind of an ineffable quintessence that
no,
you
I don't
either
say
under.
there's a correct way, but I'm asking
I
how
think I have a better
you
question.
listen to metal.
I have a better question.
All right, mate. Fuck yourself.
What is metal?
Fuck's sake.
I do have a definition. One word.
What's that?
Illumination.
Whatever. I would say it is a form of riff-based composition.
I think that's part of it. Yeah, sure.
I
I
can't be
don't
more
think.
specific than that, and without writing a fucking essay on it.
Well, yeah, and that's the issue. Is life is something that is. It's not a series of, uh, universal categories. It's life is conditioned by a localized context where small, seemingly insignificant or microscopic details can mean something beyond the purview of what you would sort of estimate it would. Like I hate to bring this up, but like the Jurassic Park. I'm talking about the book here, but I believe it's mentioned in the movie too, and it's kind of silly and put in a really like ambiguous, silly way. But the professor in it, that's played by Jeff Goldblum, he talks about chaos theory and about how seemingly small things can have an impact that you didn't foresee.
Right. And you know what the end of chaos theory is? Like the end of the chaos, the randomness.
Let Tyler
There
finish
is
the point. Let Tyler finish the point.
So, I mean, I don't want to go too far into the weeds on this. I'm just saying that I think that it's metal is something that it is an experience, and it is a specific kind of experience, and you can use several different words to describe it, but none of those words are going to be exhaustive of what that experience is, because otherwise it wouldn't be an experience; it would be a concept. Um, so, yeah, I think that pretty much
Actually,
concludes my thoughts on it.
I'll let Jason come in on this, but I think that's one of the problems that Jerry from Scale It Back makes, in that I agree with a lot of what he says, but he presupposes that there is a definition to metal that compositions must conform to in order for them to be quote unquote legitimate. Whereas, like, okay, 1991, Morbid Angel released Blessed Are the Sick, and everyone thought that this is sort of the ultimate kind of version of death metal, and then less than 3 years later, which is not a very long time. Well, actually, within those 3 years, Burzum started releasing albums, Mayhem started releasing albums, Darkthrone started releasing black metal albums, and suddenly everyone's perception of what extreme metal could be fundamentally changed. I think that's I think that's an example of what you're talking about, Tyler. Correct me if
I
I'm wrong.
believe so too. I think so
I,
too. Because by that logic, you could say that electric doom synthesis is less. Whoa, oh, yeah, less less metal than like Job for a Cowboy, for instance, because it
Yeah,
makes
yeah, yeah.
But I would argue that electric doom synthesis, despite having minimal to almost no electric guitars or any of those other commonly defined aesthetic elements of metal instrumentation anyway, is more metal, so to speak, than Job for a Cowboy because it communicates it communicates or conveys that experience. Anyway, I really want to hear what Jason has to say.
so, Shelley, are you familiarized with the caste system in India?
Nope.
Okay, so there's a system in India where, like, the priestly academic class are called Brahmins, and the lowest, the untouchables, are called Dalits. But anyway, there have been people who have tried to define what Dalitness is because they're kind of like gypsies where they have their own interpretation, like their own way of life, and they kind of frown upon people who try to theorize what that way of life is, what makes the Dalits, Dalits. And the reason why I brought this up is that it's a catch-22 because number one, Dalits, like, obviously they're the untouchables, they're the janitors, they're the people who deal with human waste, the deplorable aspects of life. However, uh, we as Westerners, we would, kind of say that we want to liberate those people. That they shouldn't, have that, lowly place in life. But however, when we try to uh, theorize and come up with concepts of the Dalits' way of life, we always come up short because the Dalits they frowned upon theorizing because that reminds them of the higher up, the Brahmin class, the caste, part in that system. And the only way that to be authentic with the Dalits is to become a Dalit. And I think the same should be metal. Like, we are the untouchables. Like, we are the losers who get into this and we find our way of life in it. We are fucking Dalits. We are, and when I said what is metal, that was catch-22 because you're damned if you do, damned if you don't try to define it. But no, it's a way of life, and to really understand what the true spirit of metal is, like, you have to live it. You
I
have to be
think I
part of it.
think sorry to interrupt again, but I think I understand where you're coming from because I have a group of friends that I've grown up with who are all into alternative music in different guises, but none of them are into metal, and I've known them for 2 decades now. Don't get me wrong, I have other friends, but there's this group of friends, very old friends that I've known for a very long time, and we've all grown up together. That we all share a passion for music, but it's all very, very different kinds of music. And they are always sort of coming at me saying, "Oh, I've recently got into XYZ genre, or I'm buying some records on vinyl records, by the way, on this or that. How has your music taste developed?" And it's not that I say like my music taste hasn't developed because it has, because I'll be saying, some of them will be getting into classical music and I will be sort of schooling them on that, or they'll be getting into dark ambient or whatever. But when it comes to metal, they'll keep constantly coming back to me and saying, "Are you still listening to metal?" I'm like, "Yes, I am." And it's like, "Why?" And I go, "Well, refer to my blog. I can't really explain it in more articulate terms than what I write on there, and we can get drunk down the pub or whatever. But it's almost like I'm imprisoned by metal. I know that sounds really fucking cheesy at this point, but it's like they, as sort of passionate fans of alternative and experimental music, they have a choice. They dip into metal and out of metal and being like, yeah, that's quite an interesting thing. I'll move on to something else. Whereas for me, who has been into metal for many, many years, and it's sort of fashioned my understanding of music in general, it's like I don't have a choice. I just need to listen to it now and then to sort of almost touch home base, like just to check in now and then. And I'll broaden what I listen to all the time. I'll listen to any number of different kind of styles and eras of music, but constantly always coming back to just listening to like an ever-flowing stream, blessed are the sick,
Yeah,
transcending hunger,
very
whatever. Like,
similar
Morbid
experience.
visions.
yeah,
So,
exactly.
yeah, I've caught in flack. It's like, why the fuck are you making penis black metal when you can play piano so well? Like, because people is like they look at the piano music as really sophisticated, and the penis black metal is really unsophisticated. So yeah, I totally understand what you mean by that. But I think metal has to be lived to be truly understood, and that's the parallel I drew there to the caste system in India, where you really can't theorize and define what a Dalit is. It has to be experienced. So,
Yeah,
and
I think that most people will only see a form of music or many things in life as sophisticated if it's a social phenomenon, because and I guess suppose there's an argument to be made in favor of this perspective, see civilization, human civilization, as more complex than perhaps what you could call raw experience, which is what you have in nature, right? There's not a subtext in nature. It's just you just experience what happens to you. And so the fact that that metal glorifies and or exalts in raw experience, I think comes across to them as juvenile, and that's why they have this attitude almost of like, "Oh, are you still listening to metal? That makes sense when you're a teenager, but you're an adult now. You need to think about sophisticated things like your place in society and what that means, and your and the emotions that you're undergoing as a result of of your social experience, and so on and so forth."
yeah, I can see that. I was a different type of kid though. So yeah, I was listening to death metal back when I was 12, and I still listen to death metal. So even when I went through puberty, I already had good grasp of extreme metal, at least from a death metal perspective, and never quite outgrown that. Like I know other people who are, they're in their 50s and 60s, and they're still diehards to today. And it's really wonderful that it is not just a youthful expression. It's something that lasts a while. I will say guitar-based music tends to be on the youthful spectrum of expression. But compared to like full symphony or anything like that, where
Yeah,
there's
well,
a sea of geriatrics. But
right. Well, Bruce
um,
Dickinson put it this way, and it's somewhat of a corny statement, but I think yeah, it actually makes a deeper point than what it sounds like on the surface. He said that there has to be some part of you that is always 15 years old to enjoy heavy metal. And that sounds like a very emotional statement, like, oh, I'm always a kid. I never grow old and jaded. But old and jaded doesn't have to just simply be like a sort of a sentimental statement. As you grow older, you more and more so become accustomed to defining things by categories. You relate things to past experiences you have because you have a larger collection of past experiences.
yeah, your
Um,
conditioning becomes more refined.
Exactly. And so you lose that youthful part of you that simply is sort of participating in and reacting to a raw experience. Well, as a metalhead, you kind of don't lose that part of you. It stays with you. You
Yeah,
always have that sense of thinking that mountains with snowstorms crowning them are fucking awesome, and that's just the way it is. You know?
yeah. Yeah,
This is
I
where
agree. Like it's something that, even though I'm totally into classical music and I like some electronic and all that, but I can never say I'm not a metalhead because, at least once a day or two, like I'll listen to extreme metal, death or black metal, along with, classical music and all that. But it's something that's part of my being. I am a Dalit. I am, a metalhead. I am a loser, and that'll always be a part of me. And I think that's not something that when I say I'm a loser, I'm talking more along the lines of what David Burke calls a loser, like just an outsider, I suppose, but and no well-betitted girlfriend, but um, it is something that is just part of my being at this point in time, and I can never shake myself of it. It's just there, and I love it still. So,
Well,
um,
yeah, like I was at Brutal Assault a couple of weeks ago, and I watched the set Immortal. Sorry, Abat plays Immortal, and it was obviously just Abat with his band just doing Immortal songs. Um, and anyone that listened to our focus episode on Immortal will understand that like the majority of the set was what we call Wacken metal stuff. But he played Call of the Winter Moon. He played The Sun No Longer Rises and things like that. But there was this moment where, because it's in the Czech Republic, it's very far inland. It's mid-August, where the sun is very, very hot, but you do get these absolutely spectacular thunder and lightning storms. And just as Abat was playing, and he happened to be playing Damned in Black, where he had flamethrowers going off at the front of the stage, and when you looked behind you, there was forks of lightning going off, and Abat was obviously acknowledging this, pointing, and going, that's what I'm talking about. And then 2 seconds later, just the heavens opened, and it was torrential rain for the entire set. And then he went into Withstand the Fall of Time, which is your opening track on At the Heart of Winter. Obviously, my shirt came straight off. Thoroughly gay experience, but it was like, this is kind of what this music was made for, and trying to explain that to someone, i.e. my parents, that have no experience of what metal is, despite the fact that they raised me as a kid and they listened to plenty of it with me blasting it from a bedroom, is quite difficult. And that's kind of what I was leading up to with, how do you listen to metal is, I guess what the question I should have asked is, if someone expresses to you an interest in metal, like, what would you play them? Would you play them something that has clean vocals, which normally means heavy metal, which is a very, very different prospect to the kind of metal that most of us listen to most of the time? Or would you try and go somewhere heavier and say, well, this person is obviously like interested in experimental or extreme music. Let's try them out on something a little bit more extreme. Like, where do you go with that?
It depends on the person I'm talking to. I kind of more so try to tool what I'm playing for them to what I know their interests are, but also make it to where I'm introducing to them what I think is authentic artistic expressions of heavy metal music. As a quick aside, though, talking about losing your shirt, sometimes people outside of metal get it even while they themselves don't appreciate it. I saw a comedian say something along the lines of, "I love metalheads. I don't like metal, but their enthusiasm is so charming. You will never see somebody rip off their shirt and whip it in the air and yell, 'Woo, R&B.'"
I mean, even the friends that I was with, who both of whom you've met actually, Jason, when you came down for Incineration, but they both turned around to me at the end of the set, and obviously we're all drenched because we'd just been through a thunderstorm. They're just like, fucking check out Techno Viking here. And I was like, I'm not the kind of guy to often lose my shirt. I'm normally the guy stood sort of midway in the crowd and just been like drinking a beer and like, yep. But there was something about that Abat set where we just had thunder and lightning where I was just like, yep, the shirt's coming off straight away.
Yeah, you got to bring some of your friends on the podcast sometime. They seem like really cool people.
Oh yeah, no, they're cool. They're cool. If you can understand the Mancunian accent, but Jason, what song would you play to a non-metalhead to get them into metal?
That's
Would
a
you
good
take the
question.
Tyler route of route, as we say in the UK, of just non-committalism?
I don't know. Like, do I see the person? I mean, you gave me a thought experiment, so it's either yes or no, right? Like, it's black or white. I would.
Okay, so you meet someone, say on your new course that you're doing, who's like,
I understand. I understand what you mean. Yeah, just like something that really symbolizes the spirit of metal. That's good. Honestly, I would give them Morbid Angel's World of Shit from Covenant, the third track, because it has the antisocial aspect of extreme metal. It has really groovy riffs that they might be able to latch onto, and it's a good fucking song. So yeah, probably World of Shit.
yeah, that kind of really speaks to our contrary approaches, I guess, in that, like, I think coming from a death metal perspective, I would definitely like reach for Morbid Angel, but I always just play fucking Emperor, always. But because I'm a black metal guy, so.
Well, it really depends on like what their background is. Are they into like sophisticated music? Because Emperor is quite sophisticated for black metal. So yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty easy just to go with like a song from one of the first three Morbid Angel or first four Morbid Angel albums to be really correct because Abominations is technically their first.
Yeah, true.
But yeah, I think World of Shit is kind of like an entry gateway song. If you like that, then you can get into the harder stuff. So, yeah, that's what I would recommend as an entry. Um, how about you, Shelley?
This
Well, you said Emperor, but is there a
Emperor, yeah.
specific
Like,
song?
oh well, if you asked me like 5 years ago, I would have said something from Anthems, but now I'll be like, no, it's gonna be Into the Night Side. Like, just play them the intro into the Infinity of Force. I think just unabashed. This is the kind of music that I like, and if
Okay.
the cacophony of noise is too much, then we're obviously speaking a slightly different language, and there's no hard
So
feelings
when I was
there.
in
But
high school, in ninth grade, I was already way into death metal, and I was getting into Emperor. And I asked, death metal guy, he was really like Napalm Death. He went to a Milwaukee Metal Fest. He was a couple grades ahead of me,
do you mean
and
death metal guy from Terminus, or just a death metal guy?
no, from high school, ninth grade, uh, when I went to school,
Oh,
the
sorry.
first
Okay.
time.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, when I was a kid, I, I had death metal patches on my backpack, and there was this guy, I forget, his Kevin or some shit, and he uh, he was a few years older than me, and he went up to Milwaukee Metal Fest, and we chatted a lot about extreme metal, and I told him about my past with it, with Alan Moses, blah blah blah. But he could not fucking stand Emperor. I never got that. Like, he's one of the few people I knew at that point in time that really liked extreme metal, but he did not like Emperor. So I don't know if I would choose Emperor. But yeah, I think Morbid
Hmm.
Angel, like they're not exposed to any extreme metal. I would probably choose The World of Shit, and if they don't like that, then yeah, I probably won't have anywhere to go with them on that topic. But how about you, Tyler?
Uh, Difficult for me to answer. Nowadays, I usually like to give people playlists, although I will say, commenting on Emperor, that when I was a teenager and I was into a bunch of underground death and black metal like I am now, and I met my circle of friends who are still my buds, they were all into like melodic death metal, like Children of Bodom, In Flames, stuff like that. And I wanted to introduce them to black metal. And the band that I tried everything from Burzum to Darkthrone, and they found it all pretty abrasive. The band that was the gateway for them was Emperor, actually. That was the one that they were able to latch onto first. And then over time, I corrupted them to the point where they, forsook melodic death metal entirely, and now they're all, seasoned underground death and black metal fans. But
Was it
so
was it in the Nightside era that
Oh yeah, it was in the Nightside era. I was done with albums beyond that point at that point in my
mm,
life. So, um, but I had just discovered the Dark Legions archive around that time, so I was full head bore on with their approach to metal. Um,
Yeah,
okay, okay.
yeah.
yeah. I mean that obviously there's the anus connection here, and that being informative. Like when I read the Morbid Angel reviews on Anus back when I was like 14 or 15, I was like, wow, this guy really understands Morbid Angel better than everything else I've read online. So, yeah, I mean, that's a good starting point, but I wouldn't say that's like the holy grail of extreme metal. I think there's a lot of wonderful things outside of the DLA that are worth experiencing. Not necessarily Mephitis. I know Shelley that that'll be the first man,
Oh, you want to
but yeah,
you
I
hate
think we
Forest
should
here.
wrap up. I think we should wrap up. And Shelley, today when we wrap up, I want the last song to be one of my penis black metal songs. Since this is 100, we're celebrating. Let's give the people some penis black metal.
Okay, well, if you send me an MP3, absolutely I will.
Yeah, I will.
Because
Yeah, I'll
when
send
you
you an
when you
MP.
said I have to put what was it um the last band that we had to put on, I had to download it illegally because it was not available anywhere else. I probably shouldn't say that online, but
Oh shit, the Lethal Prayer.
the Lethal Prayer, yeah, it was not available anywhere else. I had to download it on SoulSeek.
You could ask me for it. I have the CD around here somewhere. But
Oh,
anyway,
you had tied my hands.
uh, yeah, I will send you that MP3. Any closing thoughts on gatekeeping? I think we diverged quite a bit, but that's to be expected. Shelley, um, trade unions.
I mean, I'm not going to wrap up on trade unions, but I think I touched on it already. But gatekeep away. Have standards. Love the music that you love. Don't let other people manipulate you into liking music that you don't like. And if you want to listen to more metal, then read about it, listen to it. Do please join, but also understand it. And yep.
Yep. It's not just visceral experience of having loud amplifiers. There's narrative structure. Tyler, go ahead.
Yeah, my final thoughts are I'm really excited about having including Jason's music as the closing song, but also on an episode about gatekeeping, we are missing out on a valuable opportunity to play Metal Warriors by Manowar. Jokes aside, yeah, um, jokes aside, I actually really like how this episode diverged for being the 100th episode of our podcast about heavy metal music. And, we had a subject to kind of define conversation about gatekeeping, and then we ended talking about what is valuable about heavy metal, what we find valuable about it, and why we find it so awesome, which I think is very fitting. So I'm very happy with it.
Excellent. All right, audience out there, if you have withstood our conversation today and you're now listening to me right now, you're about to hear some penis black metal that I wrote.